This is the third presentation on Twin Cities streetcar history. This one is on facilities and infrastructure. Now the picture up on the board right now shows the horse car map of St. Paul as it was at the end of horse car operations in 1889. Now you can see that this is what they accomplished in, I guess that would be 17 years. Yes, in 17 years from 1872 to 1889. One of the things that I want to sort of impress on everybody as we go through this was that the streetcar company was a for-profit organization, and all of these improvements were done with private money. And so here you can see they put together, lines radiating out 2 or 3 miles from downtown St. Paul, including the cable car lines going out East 7th Street and going out Selby Avenue. So this is the situation in St. Paul. Here's what they built in Minneapolis. Now they were still two separate companies, Minneapolis Street Railway and St. Paul City Railway, but they were both under Lowry's control. And here you can see it's even a bigger system that has gotten built. And then on top of that, this is the motor line right here, the steam-powered motor line, which they acquired in 1886, even though it was built under separate ownership. And this actually had gotten all the way out to Lake Minnetonka from 1882 to 1886, but then they cut it back. These lines were all, of course, horse-powered, and so there were a whole series of horse car barns. This is the one over at 27th Avenue South and 27th Street called the Minnehaha Barn. And this was sort of a typical facility. You had horses stabled on the ground floor. You had supplies and such up on the upper floor. As a matter of fact, in a lot of these places, they actually had manual elevators where you could bring in a hay wagon and run it up to the second floor and unload the hay up there in the hay mow. In downtown St. Paul, if you know where the Lowry Hotel is there, right across from St. Paul City Hall on the block bounded by 4th, 5th, St. Peter, and Wabasha. The reason that's called the Lowry Hotel and Lowry Medical Arts Building was that was actually where the largest of the St. Paul streetcar barns were. That was the company headquarters. And there they had an elevator where they would lift streetcars up, horse cars up to the second floor to repair them. It was a manual elevator. Here's another one of the horse car barns. Not quite sure where this one is at. This might be up on Monroe Street Northeast. And here's a page from Electric Railways of Minnesota where you can see the floor plans of a series of these horse car barns. The horse car barns, because horse cars were slow, you had, something like 10 horse car barns in each city, almost one for every single line, because the horse cars really couldn't travel that far. There were 3 generations of car houses or car barns that Twin City Lines wound up building between 1872 and 1915. The first were the horse car barns, and then there were 2 generations of streetcar barns. We'll get to that later. But you can see the horse car barns were really quite small. The largest of them was the Smith Avenue barn, which was down by 7 Corners in St. Paul. And this and a couple of the others were used for a while for the electric streetcars. They were adapted for electric streetcars, but they were all gone by about 1908, 1910. So from 1872 all the way up to 1933, in almost every single year, Twin City Lines was building track, and this is just kind of a representative look. And of course, they had to do more than just build the track. They were building the street around the track. Under their franchises with the city, and here you can see the city of Minneapolis, City Hall in the distance, they were responsible for the paved area where the tracks were, which is to say the center 2 lanes of the street. So this is the system. You can't see the whole St. Paul side of the system, but this is the system as it eventually grew. Now, when they converted from horse cars to electricity, they had to relay all of the tracks that existed, because the horse car tracks were really very lightly constructed. They were not up to the job of carrying electric streetcars. Plus, in Minneapolis, The Minneapolis horse cars were 3-foot gauge, and they had to widen the tracks to 4 foot 8.5. They also had to electrify all this, and Lowry went heavily into debt to accomplish all that. One of the things that this map reveals is that sometimes they made a mistake, and they built lines that had to be taken apart and then put back together. It's not shown on here because it's on the horse car map, but they had built a little branch line off a horse car line down Stevens Avenue, and then when they bought the motor line on Nicollet, they had to tear that up. They had built a horse car line down DuPont Avenue to a little residential real estate development down by Lake Harriet, and that was only there for about 4 years, and they tore that up. When they went and ran the line out Hennepin Avenue, they tore up this track that was on 27th Street. When they built the Snelling Avenue line up through the village of Hamlin, they eliminated this trackage right here and substituted this trackage here. They redid in 1904 the line through that they had just built in 1898 through Como Park. They built a little extension on 8th Street Southeast, and then when the Johnson Street line went in, they abandoned that and they abandoned this. They built the Randolph Avenue line out in the 1890s and then cut it back completely to 7th Street and then rebuilt it about a decade or two later. So there were a number of places where, frankly, they made a mistake and they had to go and redo their investment. They built some specialized facilities, and this is the yard for the State Fair. You can see the grandstand here. This yard actually projected all the way into the fairgrounds to the base of the grandstand ramp. Just to give you an idea, there were 2 big loops, one for St. Paul, one for Minneapolis, and big storage yards for each. They built this in 1907, quickly discovered that they had hooked up the wrong end. They had configured it with the storage tracks facing the wrong way and had to redo it a couple of years later. But this was a facility that was only used during the State Fair and at no other time. There was another one in 1905, just southwest of the Veterans Hospital today, was the Minneapolis Motor Speedway. And when I first saw this photo, I thought it was for the State Fairgrounds, but in fact, it's the Motor Speedway. It hosted about 3 races in its existence and then promptly went out of business. And yet they had built about a half-mile line and this enormous streetcar terminal to get to it. These guys, by the way, are standing up on the top. These are crew members standing on the top of the car, and they're watching the race. So along come the electric cars, and they were able to recycle some of the horse car facilities, this being the motor line roundhouse that was built for steam engines and functioned for a while as the main electric car shop in the system. And this was the old Selby Avenue cable car powerhouse and car house, and it's been modified for use by electric cars. This is the original building that was constructed for horse cars and then cable cars. As a matter of fact, you can see this lighter brick building and the smokestack was the first powerhouse for cable cars. Well, the cable cars did not happen, so this building was used for electric cars and for generating power for the streetcar system for a while. This is 31st Street Station down at 31st and Nicollet, and this was one of a couple of 3 new car houses that they built, the first generation of electric car houses. This is East Side Station, and this is the only one of these first generation car houses that lasted to the very end of service in 1954. In fact, it was the very last car house of all. This is Midway Station, and it was replaced by Snelling Station in 1907. Smith Avenue Station also went out of existence in 1907, replaced by Snelling. Interestingly, this building is still there. It's got a different front. It doesn't have the big doors on it anymore. But if you were standing looking at it today, it's a block east of University Avenue on Raymond Avenue, and you would be looking through the Green Line station at this building. But it's still there. You can check it out. Now, These first generation buildings and these repurposed buildings had two big disadvantages. First, they were not fireproof. And in a lot of cities, there were car barn fires where electric streetcars mixed with wood frame buildings resulted in major fires. It didn't happen here, with the exception of a storehouse over at Snelling that burned down in 1925. But they were still not considered fireproof. The other problem with these, as you can see, and this is East Side Station here, is that they had stub tracks, and you had to back the streetcars in and pull the streetcars out. It was even worse over at the old Selby Powerhouse, where you pulled the streetcar in and then you had to put it on a transfer table to reach the other tracks. Very awkward. So they decided that they needed a third generation of car houses, a second generation of electric car houses. Oh, by the way, they also built a small satellite car house. This is it, little wood frame car house at Owen Street on the northwest edge of Stillwater. This is the substation, which is still, the substation is still standing. And this was because they had a set of 3 local streetcar lines that serve Stillwater, Oak Park Heights, and Bayport. Now, in the midst of all of this, they built a major project, the Selby Tunnel. It was a 1,000-foot-long tunnel, and this was to replace the remnant of the cable car, the counterweight, where they had little counterweight cars that would ease streetcars up and down the very steep 16% grade of the hill up to the cathedral. They replaced it with the Selby Tunnel that lowered the grade to 7%. Once again, a major infrastructure project. And by the way, you can go out here today and this tunnel porthole is all still there. It's deteriorated, but it's still there. So in 1907, they opened Snelling Shops and Snelling Station. And this is a major development. You can see the property outlined over here. This is the corner of Snelling and University Avenue, and Snelling Avenue. And it's divided into 2 parts. This is Snelling Station right here. And this is where the day-to-day operation of the streetcars occurred. You see the streetcars in the storage yard. And running repairs were done in the Snelling Station shop. But the other part of the property is Snelling Shops. And this was a streetcar factory and heavy maintenance facility. And it replaced the 31st Street shops that were over at 31st and Nicollet. They had built 500 streetcars over at 31st Street shops. They built another 700 plus over here. And they moved from building to building on this transfer table. And then in the far end of the property was the track department and the overhead wire department. This is the Montgomery Ward site. And this had rail connections. The Milwaukee Road came in the back of the shop so you could deliver directly to it. This is the map of it. And you can see here, and you'll see in the subsequent drawing I want to show, that here the streetcar barn and the yards, everything has through movements. So a much more efficient track arrangement. This is another view of the transfer table and the Snelling Shops. And these were all fireproof buildings, concrete and made with concrete block that was manufactured on site. Twin City Lines was the single most self-sufficient streetcar system in the country. Not only did they build all their own cars, but they also went and cast all their own overhead wire poles. You see one of them right here. And they made the buildings out of concrete and cast the concrete blocks. They built the first of 4 stations that were to essentially the same floor plan, or slight modification of the floor plan, with offices and crew facilities and all, and then running repair shops, once again built of fireproof materials. This is University Avenue running here. Here's a view of the west end of it. You can see the shop tracks. On this end of it is a substation. Snelling was the only one that actually had a substation built into the car house. And on the east end of it, on University Avenue, this is the Employment Bureau, where the hiring for the entire system. And here are 2 subsequent ones. Northside Station and Lake Street Station. Nicollet Station also had the same basic design. But you can see how you have through movement and you have facilities that are, the car house is roughly the same thing. Here's Nicollet Station. For a while, they kept the old roundhouse. Later, that was torn down when they expanded the storage yard. This powerhouse was kept. This was actually the second powerhouse that was built for cable cars that were never implemented in Minneapolis, and later this was replaced by a boiler within the building. And here you see a nice berm with flowers saying Nicollet. This is a view of the Nicollet yard. And by the way, they kept the poles up and the cars pumped up all the time. Every other system has trolley pole hooks where you can hook the pole down. Didn't have them in Twin City lines until PCC cars showed up. This is Lake Street Station, which is located over just west of Lake and Hiawatha, where the High Lake Shopping Center is now. And Northside Station up at 26th Avenue North in Washington. This is the only one of these car houses that is still standing. It's been modified and it's used as a light industrial building now. And then this is Duluth Avenue Station, where they tore down the original East 7th Street wood frame station and built a new one on the property. It's a somewhat different configuration than the others just because of the way the property looked, but that was also built between around 1910. They had two office buildings. This is the main office building in downtown Minneapolis at 11th and Hennepin. And then they had an office building in downtown St. Paul over at College and Wabasha, which is where I-94 comes through. This is it in the latter days when they were getting rid of it. So here's the system as it was in 1909. You can see it reaches all the way out to the St. Croix River, White Bear Lake, and downtown White Bear. Out to Lake Minnetonka, you can see the boat routes here. There's the Big Island Ferry and the dotted lines of the other boat routes serving the lake. Big operation. And so, of course, you had to build track to get out to it. And this is the private right-of-way. This is in Hopkins at Blake Road, next to Blake School. And what they did here is they built out on the old motor line right-of-way, but they straightened out the right-of-way, regraded it, and double-tracked it. And one pretty large piece of infrastructure, when they got to Hopkins, they had to leap up and over 3 different railroad lines. So they did it with this big S-curving trestle, which was built in 1905 and 1906. Once they got out to Excelsior, this is the Excelsior streetcar station right on the edge of the lake, and the storage yard for the streetcars, and then beyond it, passengers would transfer to boats at the Excelsior dock station. And here's what that looked like. Here you see 3 of the Big Island ferries at the Excelsior dock station. Up in the cupola here, there was a dispatcher who was responsible for dispatching the boats and the streetcars, and it was also the Commodore of the fleet, who was the main supervisory person for the streetcar, for the boats. This building, by the way, lasted when they built Excelsior Amusement Park here starting in 1925. This building became the Dodgem car ride, so it lasted into the 1960s. Also at Excelsior, they built this simple wood-framed boat building for repairs, and in 1915 or 16, I forget which, they actually rebuilt. They actually built the 7th steamboat, the Excelsior, inside this building. This boat is up on, this is a wide gauge railroad track, so you could take a boat out of the lake. There are rolling dollies here, one under the front, one under the rear. Interestingly, one of these dollies survives today at the Shorewood Yacht Club. You can go out and see it. And they leased the Tonka Bay Hotel from the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad in 1907 at the same time that they leased the Tonka Bay branch of that railroad. And so they were running this hotel from 1907 to 1911 when it shut down. And of course from 1906 to 1911 they built Big Island Park, which, although they hauled thousands and thousands of people out to it, it was only on summer Sundays that happened because the 6-day work week was still in effect. And so even though it was very popular on the summers that it was open, it wasn't enough to have the summer Sundays were not enough to pay to keep this in operation. But you can go out there today. It's in Orono City Park. The walkways are still here. The bases of these things are there. The concrete bases of all these buildings are still around. It's an interesting thing to see. A more successful operation that the streetcar company had was Wildwood Park on the southeast shore of White Bear Lake. And here you can see they had a roller coaster, dance pavilion, water slides, various rides, and this lasted until 1939. They had a station at Como Park, and they actually had two different stations. This is the original wood station, where the cars would make a loop around the block into this station. Now later on, they redid the line to make it more direct, less circuitous through the park, and the city of St. Paul Parks Department built this stone station, which functioned both as the depot and also as a park office. That, of course, is still there today. If you go in, they've actually put in the floor of the big room there a stylized map of the streetcars of St. Paul. This pedestrian bridge was built by Twin City Lines, is still standing, and a couple of years ago was completely restored. And of course, the building at Lake Harriet, the Chalet Station, which not only functioned as a depot, but also had an ice cream and confectionery. On the second floor here, the windows opened up so you could look out over the lake, and then there's a holding cell in the basement for the park police. From the 1880s up until about 1902, Twin City Lines was the concessionaire for all the amusements at Lake Harriet. And they built a series of 3 pavilions, which got blew down or destroyed in other ways. The first one was hard up against the tracks. This is the second one on the shore of Lake Harriet. And then this is the third one, also built out over the water. And so anyway, Twin City Lines was responsible for running all of these. Power generation. You've probably all seen the power plant that's located at the east end of the Stone Arch Bridge. Now it has 4 metal stacks on it, but this is it right here. And this was called the main steam station, and it generated the power for the streetcar system. Built a few years, it was built in, I think, about 1906, 1907. Built a few years before it was this hydro station down below the falls. And they also had a hydro station up above the falls. And the hydro stations, among other things, allowed them to take boilers and generators down in the steam station during the summer for maintenance. This is 1896. This is the hydro station under construction. Now, to get the power to where the streetcars were, they had a conduit system. And you can see the conduit lines running underground along University Avenue, along Selby Avenue and Lake Street, and a series of other places to take the conduit all over the system. These little dots are manhole covers. And the conduit system took the power to a series of substations, most of which were built to a standard design. This is the one on 4th Street Southeast at about 3rd Avenue Southeast. And this happens to be wire car number 3, which is the Minneapolis overhead wire car. And inside the substations, you had rotary converters, and you had big panels of gauges and knife switches. 3 of these substations survive today. The one out in Stillwater, there's one up in North Minneapolis on Lowry at 3rd Street, and this is the one on Concord Avenue, located halfway between Robert and Wabasha. So from the substations, you had to get the electricity to the streetcars. This is University Avenue over by Highway 280 today, and initially all the lines were built with center poles to carry the overhead wire. Later on, the entire overhead wire structure was changed to span wires, and I think because vehicles were running into these overhead wire poles. So here you see a typical arrangement. This is Lake Street at Blaisdell, and here you see the overhead wire pole, and you see the span wires on the other side of the street. In downtown, as part of what they called the City Beautiful movement, in both downtowns, they wanted to reduce the visual clutter of having all these poles sticking out of the sidewalk. And so where a building was available, they would actually go and sink an eye bolt into a building up at that height and hang the span wires from that. You can go through downtown Minneapolis today and see buildings dating from, say, before 1950, and the eye bolts are still in the buildings. And that's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much.